This is Restless. Welcome back to Restless, a postmortem on the young, restless, and reformed, which might be dead, which might be on life support, but we'll find out more today.
It's definitely vaxxed.
It's definitely vaxxed.
Vaxxed and masked all the way.
That is for certain. I am your host, Matt, and I am joined by Pastor Michael, who is already jumping in with quality, and so
I'm jumping the gun a little bit.
No,
hey, it's great to be with you guys again.
It's great. We love doing the show. Thank you to the patrons who've joined us and are supporting the show.
Seriously, this has been awesome. I was not expecting even what we've already got. I think we have 11 people signed up for the various levels of Patreon.
So join us there for an extra show every week and other bonus content as we go. But today we have a thing to talk about that kind of everyone has already seen. And the reason we're talking about it is because it has a huge amount of overlap with the Young, Restless, and Reformed, and Big Eva, and the Gospel Coalition, and the main leaders of evangelicalism. And it is the Megan Basham article, How the Federal Government Used Evangelical Leaders to Spread COVID Propaganda to Churches. Pastor Michael, I assume you saw this article when it came out.
Yeah, and just to make it clear, like, it's not simply evangelical leaders. It's almost exclusively, I guess not exclusively, but it's almost all YRR guys.
Yes.
You know, almost exclusively that she deals with. There's a couple others, but others that have made their kind of, names known within the YRR circles. And so it's interesting to see this end of things. And we've talked in the past about kind of one of the driving forces of a lot of YRR work was that they didn't want to be like that old school religious right, like we are just because we're Christians, we are Republicans, and that's our understanding of political engagement. And articles like this, articles like we're also going to talk about from David Brooks, books like Jesus and John Wayne that I just finished reading this morning, so we'll talk about that at some point. All of these kind of seem to make the point that actually they did the exact same thing. They did the thing that they were so mad about the previous generation for doing.
Right. I mean, Pastor Michael, how would you summarize this article? I started summarizing it to my wife as I knew we were going to be talking about it, and her jaw dropped open. She could not believe what I was saying. So if you were to summarize the basics of this article to someone else, the general force of it, how would you summarize what was found in this article?
So basically, Megan Basham, is that right?
We hope so. We would seriously love to have you on the show.
Yeah, Megan, if you hear this, hey, if you're listening to this, tag her in this and send it to her. We'd love to sit down and talk with her some, because we think that'd be fascinating.
We think she is one of the few journalists who seem to have an understanding of evangelical Christians and is attempting to report on them. I think most other religion reporters don't understand the evangelical field really at all.
Yeah, well, and so this article, it was very well done, like from a journalistic standpoint, at least reading it, right? So reading a lot of different articles by so-called journalists, usually it's not just like, hey, here's this really well-researched piece with the receipts. It's more like, here's my personal thought with a couple of quotes or facts thrown in. And now clearly from this article, Megan Basham has a particular bent. Also, she's writing for the Daily Wire. Right. So that's just expected that, yeah, of course, there's a bias there. But the difference here being, I think it's just understood. Like, yeah, sure, there might be bias. But look, I'm giving you all of the evidence. You can check it for yourself.
And to be fair to her and to the Daily Wire, it is published in their opinion section.
Yeah.
And I will say, basically every fact she reports is publicly verifiable. Now, I did see after she published this a complaint that some of these organizations were deleting things that she was linking to.
That is just wild, because they would never do that.
I know.
But going back, so like,
how would you summarize this article?
If I'm to summarize,
why did this article, and then we'll talk about why this article caused such a stir.
Yeah. So the summary of the article is that well-known evangelical leaders were quick to parrot what whatever Francis Collins wanted them to about the coronavirus and what measures should be taken in the church in order to slow its spread. So that's like the general idea, that very, very quickly and without a lot of pushback, there were evangelical leaders and pastors who were quick to join in with Francis Collins to push particular measures of how to deal with the coronavirus pandemic.
Mm-hmm. And we'll read a few quotes from it because it is now behind a Daily Wire paywall. But yeah, I think the article is largely two things. It is a bit of a profile of who Francis Collins is and his interaction with evangelical leaders about coronavirus mitigations, mandates, and what they should do. And I think just so you know who Francis Collins is in the U.S. government, he was Anthony Fauci's boss, and he presents himself as some form of an evangelical Christian. And what you find in the article is throughout many interviews and many connections he has, basically what you can imagine him doing is what Anthony Fauci was doing in the mainstream media. He was doing that with the faith-based conservative Christian leaders, right? I mean, here's a direct quote from Francis Collins. She uses, "I want to exhort pastors once again to use your credibility with your flock to put forward the public health measures that we can know can work." Right? So Francis Collins, I think what is, in my mind, was shocking about the first large majority of this article is that Francis Collins essentially saw his role as convincing Christian leaders to become mouthpieces of, and again, right, this is what she says, of the NIH, National Institute of Health, and the federal government's positions on what they should do in light of the coronavirus. That's what I think was shocking. So, Pastor Michael, why do you think this article kind of caught fire the way it did?
Well, so I think a lot of this stuff was already coming out, a lot of the stuff that Megan Basham brings together, but I did not see a lot of places where it was all brought together so succinctly.
Yep.
So number one, this article doesn't shy away from, it doesn't just say evangelical leaders were, supporting Francis Collins. It calls out specific people and shows specific instances of how they did that. So it starts by talking about Ed Stetzer, right? Ed Stetzer, and how he...
Old Ed.
Good old Eddie.
Is he an op-ed? It's back.
Oh, man. So, Ed Stetzer, if you don't remember from, his fame of The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, where he very classically said something like, it'd be interesting to find out if maybe we had a role in
I mentioned Mark Driscoll. I can't believe what happened.
Right. Definitely, he was an early mentor of Mark Driscoll. To my knowledge, has not come out and taken any responsibility for that. I'll just read what she has here. He's the executive director of the Billy Graham Center. He is or was an editor at Christianity Today. He was the executive director of Lifeway. So this is big stuff, right? And we all know his name.
Yep.
This is Ed Stetzer is a pretty big deal in
now
the evangelical world.
He is responsible for the website from the Billy Graham Institute, the coronavirus, and the church. And from Wheaton, he put together this faith-based website about what you should do for your church in the coronavirus, right? So it links to CDC guidelines, church online, resource partners.
First video is Dr. Francis Collins.
Another interview with another NIH doctor, and I guess a second interview with Francis Collins, and all by Ed Stetzer. Questions about what you should be telling people about the vaccine.
This is a real website. We're actually looking at it right now.
Right.
It's bad.
Yeah. And okay, this is again, we always give this caveat, but I do think it's important we give it again. The criticism we're making, maybe, and again, I don't know what the reporters, I don't know what her view would be. Our criticism is in no way about what your local church pastor did. This is not a criticism of if your church took too many precautions or too few.
We're not even just like, we're not making a like, here's what like the medical science
exactly
says.
We are also not making a decision about what you should have done about a vaccine or how you should feel about any of those things. What we are saying is that I believe what we started talking about when we began talking about the Canadian pastors is this is state religion. This is a literal state actor telling pastors what they should say.
Right, what the church should do. And so telling pastors and ministry leaders, hey, this is what we want you to do and say, and then those pastors just doing it.
Right.
Right, literally establishing a website, which, by the way, how much money did he get to make this website?
Right.
It was a lot of money. I guarantee it, right? I mean, he got government funds to do this.
Yes.
And so the Billy Graham Center, right? A center all about evangelism, puts out a website about what you should think about vaccines, about the origin of the coronavirus, about masking children in schools. Like, what is this?
Right.
What are you doing?
And so, again, we I have never been as interested in what are the origins of the coronavirus. It is very weird that Ed Stetzer and Francis Collins thought it was important to have pastors say this did not come from a lab. I don't know. I've never been very interested in that.
It's almost
it's
almost like one of them was trying to cover that fact up.
Yeah, but it's just why would my pastor ever need to what I don't understand why a pastor would need to have an opinion really about this, right? So we have so then we have discussions of Russell Moore, who in the time where questions about religious liberty were most at question, and actually that relationship, we could have had a very interesting conversation, right? But instead, what we got was the quote from Francis Collins to Russell Moore: "This is not a political statement. This is not an invasion of your personal freedom. This is a life-saving medical device." Talking about a small mask.
Right, so Russell Moore, so Ed Stetzer, Russell Moore,
Tim Keller,
the Gospel Coalition. So the Gospel Coalition, though it did not maybe have the same kind of like interviews and things like that some of these other organizations and people did use, she does point out how the Gospel Coalition used for several essays basically exclusively information from Francis Collins as their basis for the things that they were sharing. And another thing that, they included, like when Ed Stetzer and Francis Collins are speaking and they talk about basically the conspiracy theory that this started in a lab, or when Francis Collins shares with Russell Moore or others that, this couldn't have started in a lab, which again is just now out. Everybody agrees. Yep. Okay. It was funded and started in a lab funded by NIH. That's just
your church should have positions on vaccines or
right. Any of that, like, it's just weird. And then the Gospel Coalition, like, much like how, maybe they do in other situations, they, compare on the Gospel Coalition, right? Like, what is the Gospel Coalition for? Well, they talk about this and they compare what it is to believe that, where the virus started. Certain beliefs, meaning at that time, the belief that this virus began in a lab. Well, that is the same as believing in QAnon, or it's placed alongside QAnon beliefs, which is just, that seems pretty far afield to me. Those seem like pretty radically different ideas.
But maybe the worst one, in my opinion, was the comments that were just taken from Rick Warren. Now, we'll put it this way. Here on this show, we're not putting tons of trust in Rick Warren overall, but I really think this is like across the line, horrifying. Like this was like what really shocked me.
Remember too, by the way, like Rick Warren played a pretty like meaningful role in the whole rise and fall of Mars Hill story, and Mark Driscoll's rise. So like, we've talked about him a little bit in the past, maybe not too much. I don't know how much, but he was obviously such an influential figure. I forget that Rick Warren is still like a thing and around.
Right.
I just assume that like he has not been around for a decade, but I guess he's still there. He's still got a church.
This quote should be the end, but so Rick Warren says a thing that you've probably heard, right? Wearing a mask is the great commandment. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's already a concerning application of it. But I would say the big statement is where he describes what he believes is the role of religious leaders. Let me just say a word to the priests and the pastors and rabbis and other faith leaders. So one, at this point, Rick Warren does not care about Christianity. He's just that if that wasn't the biggest,
this is a political social role now, right? It's just if you're a leader in a faith tradition.
This is the end of Christianity. Rick Warren is now just a mainline leader. He is not a Christian leader anymore. He's now just big guy people like. And this is shocking. And so then he says, right, and so the idea that me as a Christian minister has the same job as a rabbi, or what are the other faiths he's talking about? He's talking about, right, he's talking about Judaism, he's talking about Islam, right? He's talking about these other things. And he says he's given them all the same job, this is already beyond the pale for me. The idea that is his ministry appreciated by all these people? My mind is blown. But then what he says, this is our job, to deal with these conspiracy issues and things like that. One of the responsibilities of faith leaders is to tell people to trust the science. They are not going to put out a vaccine that's going to hurt people. Now, I'm not laughing at hurt people or the vaccine. I'm laughing at the fact that he says it's the role of faith leaders to say, trust the science.
The role of pastors is to say, trust the science. Wow, that's pretty bad. Maybe that has something to do with the fact that the first time that Rick Warren met, evidently, this is in the article.
This is so bad.
The first time that Rick Warren met Francis Collins was in Davos for the World Economic Forum.
Right.
And that he also met more recently when this came out with Collins for an off-the-record meeting with key faith leaders, which, by the way, I want to know who those guys were.
Oh, yeah.
Who all was there, right? Ed Stetzer was probably there. That's Russell
right.
Moore was probably there.
Right.
I'm just assuming.
Who's
at
getting
this
the dark
point.
money?
Yeah, that's what it feels like. This kind of stuff makes me a conspiracy theorist. I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist.
Right.
But you have a government actor, right? A government actor who is going to key leaders within evangelicalism and having them parrot a particular point of view that they have, and even saying it in such a way that it says this is the role of the faith leaders, right? This is the role of pastors, of churches.
And use your spiritual authority to present this as your flock's duty.
Right. And what makes this, you might be able to argue. Well, you might agree with the position.
Yep.
You might be able to argue, hey, there might be a time that it would be beneficial for pastors, because of their influence, to help out those in the civil realm with something, right?
Sure.
To use their influence for some kind of good. That may be okay in
like
some
Greg
circumstances.
Locke and the witches. Sorry, I'll cut this. Like Greg Locke and exercising witches.
Exercising witches.
That's
for
a good
people.
Anyways, yeah. Sorry.
Oh no.
So
But maybe you could argue to that point. Even that could be debatable. But I think I could get to the point where I would say, yeah, there might come a time when that is necessary or good. And
we're also not talking about your pastors even talking to their county health board about how to meet in person, these kinds of questions.
This is not, again, faith leaders going and saying, hey, how do we, civil leaders, right, who we are still under the authority of in a certain way.
Yep.
What would be best for us to do outside of what we can't do, which is, stop preaching the gospel or something like that. Instead, what we have here is a secret backroom meetings of heads of state with these leaders telling them what to say. That makes me want to become a conspiracy theorist.
Where this crosses the line into, as I've been calling it, de facto state religion, is this is what you should say as a pastor. I, as a government person, am here to tell you what you should say as a pastor. That is a difference, right? A civil leader saying, I want to work with local pastors to see what we can do, if there's something we can do about the virus, or, these kinds of things. I think probably a lot of times those partnerships potentially will be harmful. Maybe not always, sometimes fine. And pastors using their influence for a specific goal is not bad. But when it is a direct, like, here's what you should say, right? Like, as a pastor, I want you to say, trust the science. Like, get up and say, trust the science.
That's such a weird...
Like,
and
use the...
especially, by the way, because all of this is a developing situation, and we now know for a fact, right, as this article points out, and as, like, you can find elsewhere,
Everywhere.
that there are many things that they said in these interviews and in these articles, and when there are many things that Francis Collins told people that were lies. He went to these people and he had them lie on his behalf.
Right. And so
that's part of what happened here.
Yes. And so the second half of this article is kind of categorizing who Francis Collins is and why he is not a trustworthy source for evangelical Christians. Basically, what the article says is Francis Collins calls himself a conservative Christian, and how he has fulfilled his role in the government is completely indistinguishable from a secular leftist bureaucrat. It's complete. That's basically, if I were to give the gist of it. Now, some of the things that have been done are disturbing. Things with tests on aborted fetuses.
Yeah, so let me just read. I'm just going to read this portion of the article. She reports that, he is not only... she links to different articles here, so I'm not... maybe some of this is, far afield. Maybe she's not quite reporting it quite right. These are all things that I had already seen, so I did not look into them again. I had already read other news articles and briefs about these things, so I don't know for sure that these are exactly right. Obviously, test everything for yourself.
Yep.
We're not saying this is absolutely right, but if it's true, and it does seem to be legitimate reporting as far as we can tell, she says this... Francis Collins, has not only defended experimentation on fetuses obtained by abortion, he's also directed record-level spending toward it. Among the priorities, the NIH has funded, under Collins, a University of Pittsburgh experiment that involved grafting infant scalps onto lab rats, as well as projects that relied on the harvested organs of aborted full-term babies. Some doctors have even charged Collins with giving money to research that required extracting kidneys, ureters, and bladders from living infants. Now, that last one, right, that's a charge.
Yep.
So that's different than the others. The other things are things that were funded under his leadership.
Yeah.
Now, some will defend that, probably, and say, well, he maybe, he maybe didn't know exactly what he was funding. He knew some of it.
Yes.
So he has defended some of these things.
So let me read the two direct quotes from him. So here are two direct quotes. This is him speaking. So here it is when he talked about fetal cell research. I think it's widely known that the NIH tried to protect the continued use of human fetal tissue, but ultimately the White House decided otherwise. We had no choice but to stand down, right? And he's talking about the Trump White House blocking the testing on fetal cell tissue, right? Which in virtually any version of pro-life you are, that is opposed.
Yep.
Right? Because it's directly profiting those who practice abortion and motivating
giving motivation, yeah,
to it.
Absolutely.
And then the second one, which he has called himself an ally to the LGBTQ. And he's committed to listening, respecting, supporting them as an advocate. What I'm saying is, did he, the question that everyone wants to know, did he know what was happening in Wuhan, right? That's kind of you're kind of pushing out. The things he says in his office and the way the office continued to run, one, is despicable.
Yeah, it's evil.
It's
evil is the word that we would use.
Yes. And two, the way he speaks in his office is indistinguishable from everyone else who holds this office, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the things, she just kind of walks through all the kind of major, kind of culture clash issues that most conservative Christians are going to find common ground on. And Francis Collins, across the board, and by conservative Christians, I mean including, at least supposedly, most of the people that are mentioned in this article, right? Guys like Ed Stetzer, Russell Moore, guys like Tim Keller, people like the Gospel Coalition, right? These are people that generally would at least espouse that they hold to these same values. They are pro-life, right? They are committed to the Bible's teaching on sexuality, these sorts of things. Well, Francis Collins explicitly denies many of these core beliefs.
Right. And yeah, if he was in a Bible believing church, the way he's speaking, these actions, he should be under church discipline,
Yeah.
not directing pastors.
Right.
And so the reason we want to talk about this is because, one, it so impacted so many leaders in the YRR, and I think one of the big things to gain from it is I think that what we are seeing, as Pastor Michael mentioned, right, the decrying of the religious right, their involvement in the culture and politics, this is in my mind de facto state religion, an example of it. And then there are two other big things. I'll give Pastor Michael, if he has any thoughts before we move on, is Francis Collins was also, and this is something we can't find in the article, so we're going beyond the article. In one, we're going to talk about Francis Collins as the model of what is called faithful presence. It's a model of witness, and perhaps we should do a whole episode on the logic behind it. We're just going to briefly talk about it. And then the final thing is some of the pushback evangelical leaders gave this article as it was published. Understandably, because it kind of impugns
it calls them out.
The whole evangelical industrial complex is going down.
Right, Big Eva is their names are mentioned.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts about the article in general before we go through before we kind of keep moving on?
I don't think so. I mean, again, it's striking. So I read it as soon as I saw it kind of being shared around, probably the day it was published. I read it, and I don't think anything in it was completely new to me. So a lot of this is, I mean, if you hang out in the kind of scenes that Restless is often, acquainted with, people are sharing articles about the misdeeds of Big Eva all the time. And so I see some of this stuff, a lot of the problems here. As we, go into talking about faithful presence, I don't remember a lot of the details of the article, but I did read an article a while ago on the American Reformer, called something like the failure of faithful presence. Highly recommend it, and going to check that out. Some good work was done there. Just as far as, again, thinking through how do we think of faithful presence in the wake of somebody like a Francis Collins, because he was the model. He's supposedly, according to Ed Stetzer and Russell Moore and Tim Keller and Rick Warren, all of these big names, he is like the go-to guy. He was such a solid Russell Moore. I think it was Russell Moore in this article is quoted directly as saying, oh no, it was Rick Warren. So I correct myself. So Rick Warren explicitly says of Collins, he's a man you can trust. which is like, if I hear somebody say that, it makes me think, should I not trust them? Like, if you have to say it like that, very explicitly, like, please don't distrust this man. It makes me think maybe I can't trust him. I don't know. But anyway, none of it was necessarily new, but it was striking when it was all put together how easily many of these people went along with whatever Francis Collins would like them to say. And we can't see like their motivations for that. There was obviously money involved for some. Some of these organizations very clearly were funded to create websites and other things to help with this push. There was clearly like a, kind of good old boys club. Like, Russell Moore is in a book club with Francis Collins. That's one of the things he talks about, I believe. And David Brooks, by the way, which will be interesting because we'll talk about an article by him in a little bit. But anyway, like, this is like a lot of these guys are friends. Tim Keller, Francis Collins talk about like they have a friendship developed. Sometimes that can blind you. Sometimes if you have somebody who you think is your friend, you're going to trust them. And I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing. I think that like having a loyalty to your friends is actually a really positive thing. In this case, there should have been more vetting, right? My friend comes to me and he says, hey, I want you to use your platform to push one particular government agenda on churches, as if it's just like the truth, and if there's like no debating it, and as if it just means love your neighbor. And
you can even understand how in a friendship it got there. If I'm Tim Keller, and I know, unlike Restless, I have a lot of people who listen to everything I say, which is why most of these people don't need Twitter, right? I'm having to make decisions about this. You can understand, and you can even understand how Francis Collins gets himself to this place. I'm going to call the guy. I'm like, well, this guy would know something about it. Hey, what do you think about this? And he'll tell me. if this happens to me enough, now I'm going to say I'm going to start going to pastors and telling them what they... And so you can understand how we've gotten to this point where it's an incredibly serious problem, but how it starts in just like...
It wasn't necessarily sinister, right?
Yeah, right.
Like, it's not started as like some sinister plot. And even reading through this, like, that's the thing. I think that you could, like, there is a... Like I said, when I read about Rick Warren at Davos, okay, like the conspiracy theory side of me kind of goes, wait a minute.
And Ed Stetzer is certainly not an op from the government. That's definitely not true.
Right. So, like, when I hear that stuff, sure, like, I get a little bit conspiracy theory-y, if that's a word. But, like, you can see how, like, all of these things can happen just on their own, naturally, as certain Christians particularly get very deeply involved in politics. And when we've talked about how the YRR were so critical of the way the religious right did that, let me just say that, the religious right had significant influence on some aspects of the government. They had significant pull as far as, like, riling up a voter base. They, did have some people like, I think it was Beverly LaHaye, Tim LaHaye's wife, was on different, panels or groups assisting Ronald Reagan. And, so some of these groups, like, they had influence in the government. But it was all pretty visible. There was some of it that was a little bit more shady in the back room.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is that they were doing the same things, except they probably had less connection to the government than Russell Moore, than Ed Stetzer, even than Tim Keller probably. Like, they had significantly, definitely than Rick Warren, right? Rick Warren is, I mean, he's talked to most of the presidents over the last,
he hosted a debate.
He hosted a debate. Like, so this guy has significant connections. That's way more than a lot of these guys on the religious right could have dreamed of having. Okay? And yet they're condemned. And these people are doing the same thing, right? They are selling the faith for political influence is what they're doing. And it's really problematic.
Yeah. And so what I think this allows us to do is, one, I think we already see the problems, but I think this allows us to take one look at and introduce our listeners, even maybe Megan Basham, who does not mention this in her article, to the concept of faithful presence. Because what you don't know is how influential this idea is on evangelicalism and on the YRR specifically. In fact, I will spoil one of the potential reveals is TGC recently produced a book called Revisiting Faithful Presence, where they have all the big name TGC people write an article on their perspective and continuing the conversation on faithful presence. Wow,
that sounds really interesting.
and it is
maybe should have waited a little while to put it out. I don't know.
Yeah, and so it is available for free. And as I've said, if there's a lot of interest in this, please let us know. We could do a full episode really walking through the logic.
It's free.
And theology of it.
We'll do it.
Yeah. And so where does this idea come from? It comes from a book called To Change the World: The Irony, Tragedy, and Possibility of Christianity in the Late Modern World. It's by James Davison Hunter from 2010. And he gives an explanation of why he wrote the book. I wrote the book because I saw a disjunction between how Christians talk about changing the world, how they try to change the world, and how worlds, that is culture, actually change. These disparities need to be clarified. And so his whole perspective is what we need to do is we need to think about how Christians engage in, quote unquote, changing the world, influencing the culture. And he proposes in a very academic way what is now referred to as the faithful presence model. So here's a little bit more about what faithful presence is. So it is a specifically post-Obergefell model. So Obergefell, if you're not an American or you don't remember, that was the Supreme Court case that has been viewed as legalizing gay marriage across the country.
2014, right?
So now that Obergefell's final death knell for Protestantism's soft establishment, by the way, we've just learned there is a soft establishment. Like, if this article told us anything, there wasn't a death knell. It's just a new one, right? And this death knell set evangelicals free at last from the methods of the religious right. For one, the language of faithful presence may be elusive, but this is a feature, not a bug. I think it's best these days to avoid an all-encompassing, sweeping cultural solution. Once we are offered these kinds of grand narratives, they led to cultural decline. The proper cultural strategy is faithful presence, he added. This is Davison speaking. Not pulling away from culture, not trying to take it over. Faithful presence within means being faithful. It means we're not going to assimilate, and we're going to be distinctively Christian. It's an attitude. Oh, sorry, this is Tim Keller speaking. It's an attitude of service, uncompromising in our beliefs, but not withdrawing or trying to dominate. So what faithful presence is, this was a Tim Keller quote about him explaining what faithful presence was. So he says, right, it's these things. We climb the ladders of culture, and we don't pull away, right? But we don't try and take it over. You act as a faithful servant in your role and don't compromise on your beliefs and serve. This is from an article called The Moral Universe of Timothy Keller from The Atlantic. So, Pastor Michael, this is the most basic perspective on faithful presence. What are your thoughts about it as you hear about it? And I'll give you 4 more points that take it a little bit deeper before we move on from this. What do you think about this idea?
Yeah, so I mean, as a general idea, it seems okay, right? So part of it does. The idea of like just being faithful and present, sure, like that's fine. Just trying to be a faithful believer in whatever place God has put you. That sounds very much like the teaching of the New Testament. Yeah. Now, when you start saying things like, you're not attempting to take it over, I don't know what that means.
Right.
So it just depends on what that means. If you mean, hey, you don't have to be like bombastic in such a way that it's like, well, I'm a Christian and so I, declare that I own this business now, and then you get fired. Well, yeah, obviously, like that would be kind of absurd. Like there is a really kind of a kind of very revolutionary, again, very kind of bombastic way of like, declaring victory over cultural, places, businesses, political groups, whatever it might be. That doesn't work. It never has. It doesn't. Okay, so if that's kind of what it's coming against, and the religious right, the moral majority kind of stuff, that fell into that a lot of the time. Mm-hmm. It really did. The way that you hear a lot of these guys, the Jerry Falwells and others speak, it was kind of like that.
Right.
But at the same time, if you're saying, but we're not seeking to change what's happening, then what are you doing?
Right. You're a nice, soft-spoken guy who says, oh, yeah, and I'm a Christian.
Yeah, so you're just there.
And again, I think that the other question becomes, even with this idea, with we don't, thank God we don't have to try and be in charge post Obergefell. The question becomes, at some point, we must follow the instructions given in Revelation where he says, get out of Babylon. There is so much rot. Like, if Francis Collins thought he could be faithfully present in the NIH while the NIH was sowing the parts of aborted babies to rats, you cannot, right?
Yeah, right.
There was no way to do that. And maybe years ago, there was a way for you to do that. But the rot is so bad. And so what that Atlantic article points out is that there are these well-credentialed evangelicals in these large urban churches like Keller's church are taught to aspire to faithful presence in these institutions. And so the thing about it that always seems to me that every time I hear it explained, everyone explains it a little differently to me.
Right. Well, and that's what it says, right? It's intentionally a little vague.
Right.
It's intentionally not exact. And part of me likes that because when you have like here is the way that you influence culture as a Christian, and it's just like across the board, it's going to look the same. Okay, Well, that can't work, right? There are different models. There are different ways of doing it. And I think whenever we try to make, here's the biblical model, that is problematic.
Yeah.
And so, okay, I like that in a way, but
Right.
also it makes it slippery so that when we say, wait, is this faithful presence when Francis Collins allows these things?
Right.
It'd be like, well, no, not that part.
It seems to me to confuse evangelism and cultural influence.
Yes.
Which, in evangelism, right, what the religious right often did that I think was a mistake is they turned, we need to get Reagan in the White House, into somehow they described that as evangelism.
Yeah, it was the same thing, right?
Not evangelism. Evangelism is telling people that Jesus came, he died, he was buried, and he rose again, and declaring the forgiveness of sins in that name, right? But a totally valid Christian activity is building institutions, reforming institutions.
Yep, starting up a business, right? Getting involved in healthcare, doing these things.
Yeah, and bringing a specific Christian worldview to these things as you're given authority. And so what it always seems to do is it seems to confuse it. Now let me share you what I'm going to describe. I think there are like 4 features of describing faithful presence. This is from a talk given at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. So
hey, shout out. I was maybe there. When was it?
I'm not sure. So the first one is, our first task must be to establish our political affections. What a weird way to start.
Who is this from?
His name is Matthew Anderson. So this is a talk given from Trinity Evangelical School by someone working there. And so their goal was to explain what faithful presence is. It said, our first task must be to establish our political affections and passions on a new foundation, which will involve expunging the atmosphere of resentment and anxiety. So I found that to be a very interesting thing. So the first thing, if we're going to have successful faithful presence, we need new political passions, right? So this is the eliminating of the religious right? Like that's the first thing, right? Whatever faithful presence is, they want it to say it's not the religious right. Secondly, it says, more personally, preserving our native habit of good cheer might require us, so this is where I think things get interesting. Preserving our native habitat of good cheer might require us we simply ignore grand cultural struggles happening around us. Faithful presence demands denying the lords of our culture war their tithes and offerings and attention, so that we can give them instead higher acts of prayer and charity, and toward keeping alive the permanent things of art, music, Shakespeare, and the play. So this is the one that I started to find very interesting, right? So if number 1 is we are not associated with the religious right, the second one says, in order to do this, we are going to have to ignore the grand cultural struggles. And so instead of bringing the Lord our war for culture, we instead bring prayer and charity wherever we go, and work on keeping things alive like music, art, and Shakespeare. Pastor Michael, what do you think about this as something that a Christian should do?
Some Christians can maybe be involved in these things, right?
Right.
Like, it's not. We wouldn't say it's wrong for a Christian to write a play.
Nope.
To enjoy Shakespeare.
Right.
I enjoy Shakespeare. It's weird that is like that has to become the thing.
Right.
But this is what happens, right? So you look at the religious right. They were like, hey, God, guns, country. Like there was this very specific cultural milieu that this idea of how to be political arose in.
Yep.
These guys are doing the same thing.
Yep.
It's just a different cultural ethos,
Right.
but it's the exact same thing. It hasn't changed.
Right. It's and what's fascinating is you can't be like the religious right. Hey, you have to lose the culture war. And now here's why. Why would you have to ignore these great cultural struggles? Because you will never be allowed into a position of culture if you say, yeah, I believe homosexuality is a sin. Goodbye.
Yeah,
you're done, right? Like it's not even a Christian can enter these things and just decide. I don't believe every Christian needs to be making public stands on every cultural issue of the day, right? Like, of course, that's not what I think. But what's the issue is that this appears to require a posture of compromise. Even though we say we don't compromise on our beliefs. We just compromise all the actions that are around our beliefs. So then the next one is evangelicals then should saturate our lives with more real obligations to our neighbors, more covenants among men to act for our mutual good, instead of vague abstractions about the importance of maintaining a courageous Christian witness on marriage. So, instead of maintaining a courageous Christian witness, which is an abstract idea, you have no idea what that means, as Pastor Michael shakes his head, you need to focus on your neighbor's good.
Right. Yeah. What? That's what it was so funny. Like, here's this vague idea, but here
more covenants among men to act for our mutual good. Yeah, that's the concrete idea.
Yeah. Oh man. So again, once again, this is projection. You're doing the very thing that you say that you're against. Right. You're doing the very same. Like, it's the same problem. Why can't you see this?
It's essentially you need to be a servant instead of like making declarations. Now, the issue is that the defense of marriage is loving to your neighbors, right? Like, it is fundamentally loving to your neighbors. Now, does the world make more sense if you focus on your direct local community? I think it probably does.
Yep.
But my problem is that when you say, let's focus on our direct local community, and in my direct local community, what if you need to make a statement about marriage? Right? Like, that's where this issue comes. Like,
that actually, it seems more fundamental on a local level than it would on a larger level, right? It's more fundamentally important with your neighbor than that you go on Facebook and you say something about, the problem with the Obergefell decision.
If this was a version of localism, which it appears to be attempting to be, like, there is a high value to actual localism.
Yeah, I'm all for that.
Right.
But no, it is, what's interesting is that these things are being said at a time when, right, so you don't need these like big courageous stands on an issue, but you're talking in a time when making any kind of strong objective critique of anything is seen as a negative way to approach the issue, right? So you're once again simply imbibing what is the culture's way of ascending the ladder of influence and power.
Right. And so it's this weird, and especially with this last one, it's this weird dichotomy I don't understand of, like, Christians get into positions of power and not use, I don't know, it's a very weird position.
Yeah, why would you get into a place of power as a Christian and not use it for the good of fellow believers, of your neighbor, of, like, why?
Well, you get in it to preserve Shakespeare. That's what you should do.
Also, how many people in culturally significant places of authority are actually trying to preserve something like Shakespeare rather than rewrite it so that it fits more our cultural values?
Right. And so then here's the fourth one that really, I think, brings it home and confuses me. A principled pluralism in all of our lives. Christian institutions that wish to be faithfully present must extend their hospitality to those who might despise us. So Christian institutions, in order to fully engage with this, have to platform and have to present, for the sake of pluralism, people who might despise us.
Yeah, so will that be reciprocated? Of course not.
No.
So what you're saying is, again, institutionally, hey, are we saying that this is a weird idea because you should never talk to somebody who disagrees with you? Of course not. I do it all the time. I do it every week. I do it like that is the normal life of anybody who wants to be involved in the world.
Right.
But if you're saying that our institutions, so like our seminaries need to hire on people that are fundamentally opposed to the truths that seminary is trying to inculcate and teach its students. Well, of course not. That's absurd, right? Like, that's literally the end of the institution as it stands.
Right. It seems to me with all of these things where it's like, we're going to serve people. We're not going to worry about these courageous stands. We're going to worry about people around us. We're going to open Christian institutions up. We are going to, we don't have those old political affections of the religious, right? Basically, what it seems to be saying is, hey, cultural elites, just so you know, we can be faithful Christians and not be a threat to this whole thing you're doing.
Yeah, we're not a threat to you. Please, and in fact, please leave us alone.
Here's our institutions. please come on in.
Please
you
have
can
them.
use them too. That's what it appears to be.
Yeah. Yeah, you wonder how this squares with the early church under persecution, not even allowing unbelievers until they have very much proven themselves to even see what they were doing in worship. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
like you can't even be engaged in the littlest bit of this. It wasn't because they weren't faithfully present where they were, right? They were being faithfully present. However, that does not look like this.
Right.
True faithful presence. So I want to talk about this a little bit, and unless maybe I'm taking us down the wrong.
Nope. Keep going.
So,
and then we'll bring it back to Francis Collins because again, he's the guy. He's the guy.
So faithful presence to me, when used in the best possible light, when thought of in the best possible light, is simply a way of saying you can be in the world but not of it. Mm-hmm. So it is not completely removing yourself from the world and from the various institutions of the world.
This is like Daniel, right? He worked in the Babylonian
So this is where I go, because people always talk about, when it comes to faithful presence, they talk about Daniel. Right? He was just faithful, and slowly he worked his way up till he was like this, really important person in Babylon, which is true. That is, partially true. Now, he did have a particular blessing of God that allowed him to do that. But it is true that did take place. What I'm interested to know is, how do we take Daniel as like the example of what we should be like, when there are other examples of what Christian leadership looks like from the Old Testament, like the Judges, like Joshua,
right,
like David, that are examples where a Christian takes authority and used it in order to secure a place or a place for God's people, or the ability to say, worship God freely again, or something like that. I'm not saying that those should be examples for us in like how we go about our political lives or how we go about changing culture. And I think a lot of people would be horrified to even begin to think about, well, what would it look like if we were like the Judges or we were like Joshua? They'd be horrified by that. I do not see any reason why you should say, well, we should be like Daniel, if you can't then say we should be like Joshua, we should be like the Judges. And even if you say, hey, we should be like Daniel, then do you know what that means? It means that even on the smallest little principle of praying publicly in a way that when you would be seen, like praying publicly, you have to be willing to give up all of that influence, all of that power, all of that cultural cachet, simply to pray. If you're not willing to do that, well, then you're not anything like Daniel. Right. Like Daniel was willing to be thrown in the lion's den to simply pray when everybody could see him.
Right.
How many of these guys who are faithfully present, if they were in these positions of power, and one of the rules of the NIH or of whatever branch of the government or wherever you want to put it, and it almost always is political, right? This usually isn't like business, although it's spoken of in terms of business sometimes. It just seems to come up a lot with politics, particularly. But even in business, right? So you're a high level executive at some large business that everybody would recognize. What if they come out with some kind of policy that says, hey, you're not allowed to pray at your desk while you're working because other people might see you, and that is not pluralistic enough. So you're not allowed to do that.
Right.
You do it. Right? Like if you want to be like Daniel, then you do it. That's all I'm saying. Now, I don't know that I think that Daniel can provide a helpful partial model for what it can look like to be faithful in a certain circumstance. But the idea that Daniel and no one else, or like you are picking and choosing, is what I'm saying. You're picking and choosing what seems to align most with what you want to do, rather than saying, what does the scripture actually teach? Also, here's my other problem with, this idea of faithful presence. For some reason, the only people that are ever considered faithfully present are on one side of the political aisle. It is never the
Right. Oh.
Hardcore Pentecostal evangelical. It's not the Mike Pompeo.
Right. Oh, how right. We literally got 4 years of how could any evangelical work for Trump?
It was
how could anyone, like, how could you do that?
Yeah, no, that's a great point.
I'm being faithfully present.
Yes, I'm being faithfully present. Like, it's never that other side. It's never, even though there are many opportunities, it seems, for evangelicals on the other side of this supposed aisle that we speak of. How come John MacArthur, how come John MacArthur is never seen as somebody who is faithfully present?
Right.
When he has become a fixture in California, when he went on things like Larry King Live,
right,
and presented the gospel, when he goes and says really silly things with Ben Shapiro about how anybody who's not a dispensationalist hates Israel or hates Jewish people or whatever, it's anti-Semitism.
Right.
Like, that's stupid, that's silly.
Yeah.
But how come this is a major cultural figure at this point? How come he's not faithfully present? You know why? Because he disagrees with your politics. Right. Because you care more about your politics, your particular progressive agenda, than you actually care about faithful presence, quote unquote.
Right. This is where these two things have been confused. But I think faithful presence, Francis Collins as an example of faithful presence shows us the issue. This is neither faithful nor presence you should want, nor presence I want in my church.
Yeah.
And so, Megan Basham, before we close, again, we could go down all these roads. If we should do a full episode on the Gospel of Reflection, the Gospel Coalition's reflections on faithful presence, there's a lot that could be discussed, right? This was believed to be the path forward, and may have been considerable at some point, but I don't think is considerable. And I think, as Pastor Michael is pointing out, it is neither consistent nor is ever offered to any of the people who worked in the Trump White House. Those people, as David French has made clear to us, are evil. Yeah, evil.
Mike Pence, who clearly disagreed with Trump even on a lot of things, who is a well-known evangelical.
He is. If Francis Collins is an evangelical Christian, so is Mike Pence.
This actually, I've never actually thought about it in these terms, but that is so crazy.
It is insane.
This whole idea of faithful presence.
He should be being interviewed by all of the faithful presence people.
Yeah, where's the Gospel Coalition? Where's Christianity Today? Where are all of these guys who
White House
to
in
Francis
the church?
Collins?
And then when these are the examples are just hilarious. Trump shows up at David Platt's church to be prayed for, and David Platt's uncomfortable praying for him. Here's your big moment to be faithfully
present with the president. He's right there.
Yeah. So people were unhappy with Megan Basham's article, obviously. So there were some quibbles, apparently people didn't like the quotes about Joe Carter. But what a lot of people wanted...
Wait. I don't even remember. When did she quote about Joe Carter?
Let me get it for you.
Did she call him Agent Joe? Because
yeah. So one article by the Gospel Coalition's editor, Agent Joe Carter. I added that, of course.
We added. She did not say agent. She's a proper journalist.
Yeah, Joe Carter linked the reasonable hypothesis that the virus might have been made be human-made with QAnon fantasies. It then lectures readers about spreading such ideas might damage the church's witness in the world. And someone went through and said, well, he's not saying they're the same thing. A very...
Right, of course, because he says it in a way that you can always say, no, right. I'm not saying they're the same thing.
But I think the most fleshed out critique of what she wrote comes from actually another person in the conservative media world, Eric Erickson. And I really think this gets down to what most of the criticisms were. Actually, she was supposed to actually have an interview with Francis Collins that unfortunately after this article got out, they canceled. If only you could have waited.
I know.
Why did you wait to publish this till after?
Seriously.
Because, here's what they said they ended up. They originally lied and said, oh, there was a mix-up. We had to do something else. Then they finally sent her an explanation of why they canceled. They said, the tone and the claims of this article are inconsistent with the gracious dialogue, biologos, is seeking to promote. He's also big into logos,
right?
Which is the evolution promoting organization from Fuller. Which, okay, another great example of like, oh, come on,
and it all makes sense.
So Eric Erickson, he published something, and it was basically his pushback. I'll summarize it and maybe read a few quotes. He starts with saying, "Could a Christian in standing oversee any department in the Nazi government?" His answer is no. He said, here's a question. Could a Christian be the CEO of a Fortune 500 company and one of its subdivisions is an entertainment company that promotes violence, sex, and even ridicules Christians? And he says, and that person is Randall Stephenson. He's an indisputably conservative Christian in the PCA. He was the CEO of AT&T when AT&T bought Time Warner, and HBO is a subdivision of Time Warner. Now, he is going to compare this man to Francis Collins. So one, let me go ahead and say right off the bat, this is a fallacious argument, because just because this guy did this doesn't make whatever his role at AT&T okay. Now, I don't know anything about the man. I'm not seeking to impugn his character at all with that statement. But I'm saying, when you say, well, if you think it's understandable that the CEO of AT&T may not have a role in what's happening in the entertainment production division of HBO, well, maybe Francis Collins' position is a lot more, at issue. I'm saying that just because this Christian is doing this doesn't actually justify anything, right? He could have a totally unjustifiable position for all I know. And you didn't tell me a lot of information. You did not give me a ton. Yep. Because here's one thing you don't get, right? There are no quotes of him saying, I'm an ally of the LGBTQ, right? Yep. There's no, like, I actually think we need to do fetal stem cell research, right? There's no, and maybe he has those views, and I would be happy to declare those as
there's also no, like, we have emails that say that you knew certain things about this virus, and then you were coming out and lying yourself, and then also trying to get all of these religious leaders to lie on your behalf.
You need to tell all the religious leaders and tell people it's okay to watch HBO.
Yeah, right. Like, that wasn't happening.
Right. And so he says, I still have some qualms about Collins' positions, though the NIH executives tell me, so he called the NIH to figure out that it's important to understand Collins does not approve and sanction all the research and funding.
So the people whose job it is to make Francis Collins look good,
right? He
didn't say that he did the wrong thing.
And a lot of the things he directly oversees, little would be controversial. Right? Because again, like, I'm sure they fund thousands of studies. And you're picking on the evil too, or whatever. Like, well, those still exist.
I'm willing to bet that there's more evil things that they do.
I'm sure. The NIH is complex, and while Collins is responsible to guide the whole, he does not improve the entirety of the budget. Two of Collins' friends told me this. So he clearly runs in the same circles and called them. And so what he then asked at the end of this is basically like, we need to stop the division, which is what you saw a lot of after this article was published. Pastor Michael's already like just shaking his head at this.
This just always seems the argument to me of people
when we lose.
When you lose. Yeah. Exactly. Like when your guy, when somebody, and I don't know, Eric Erickson seems like he's got some like okay things that he's put out before. He also seems like he was very like pro the kind of stuff that Francis Collins was pushing. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's why this is like I don't like, I'm not going to impugn motives to him. But in this circumstance, okay, let's just agree. It's possible that you could work for an organization and you don't know all the things that you're funding. Let's just say that that's true. We have express evidence that he went to religious leaders and tried to help them convince their people that certain things that we now know to be true were not true. That he knew were true at the time. Right. He expressly did that, and we all know it. Okay, that's not like this is an unhelpful division kind of a thing. That's not like those fundamentalists are at it again.
Yeah. And the division Right. This would be different if, let's give, one of these examples. If Tim Keller came out and said, wow, I have realized that potentially using my platform the way I did created problems. Or acknowledged, like, hey, I agree with a lot of things about what Francis Collins said about coronavirus. I want to uncategorically condemn these things the NIH did. Then if it's like, haha, we've got you, and now we're going to beat you over the head with this, then it's a totally appropriate time to say, you know what, you are being divisive.
Absolutely.
You are, right?
Or if Francis Collins came out and said, I didn't know about these things, I think they're evil. Instead, when he's been questioned about them, he says things like, yes, well, the NIH does currently fund fetal, research of various kinds. Like, he just does the political answer.
Right.
He doesn't do the Daniel thing in just saying what he should say that could get him kicked out.
Yeah. And so here is the advice that Eric Erickson gives us that would end the division. Let the healing begin. So number one, he gives, I don't think this is how he says it. He gives Big Eva some advice. Hey, maybe spend a few weeks going after the wokes instead of the constant chastisement against the whole bunch of people who have been nothing but chastised by the media and cultural elites over the past 4 or 5 years. And I actually think that's the experience he has in the conservative circles he's running, speaking like, hey, the fact that you chastise these people over and over again is not creating healing. And then he gives those of us dissenters, if I can borrow that term, some advice. Concurrently. Oh, great word. Concurrently. Can those of you who blast Big Eva maybe recognize they aren't the enemy, and instead of spending all your time attacking the prominent evangelicals you feel like have wounded you or the faith, actually exercise some grace? That's... Pastor Michael, you do not seem convinced. Wow.
No, so like on a general level, is it possible that people like us...
There are graceless criticisms, yes. Sure.
And that, like, we even, right? Have we fallen into a graceless criticism at times? Sure. I think that is possible. I even think it's likely at times because of just what we do,
Right.
Obviously, like this particular episode, not very winsome.
Right.
Even in Winsome Winter, not very winsome. But here's the problem with this. We have somebody who claims to be a Christian in a place of influence held up as an example of that Christianity, who has been engaged in anti-Christian work, anti-Christ work. I'm not trying to call him an antichrist. He might even be a Christian.
Right.
He has done things that are morally reprehensible.
Right.
That no member of a church in good standing could do without being disciplined in a church that faithfully carries out church discipline.
Right. If you found out that was happening, the faithful thing to do is go, I have to find a way to get this to stop.
Yep. Right. To do something. Or even, you could resign and protest.
Yeah, exactly.
A lot of people do that in governmental work. Hey, I just found out this horrible thing is happening. I'm going to resign and protest. Maybe you didn't do that right away. Hey, maybe come out now that all this controversy is out there and say, you know what, you're right. We shouldn't take the skin of aborted babies and sew it to rats.
Right.
I'm mad about this.
Of course, because it's horrible.
Yeah, no, so this is what's crazy.
And let me say this. The problem with Eric Erickson is the promotion of this is the enemy of all that is good.
Yes. It's right. It is not loving. It is not caring to our neighbor, right? None of this is good. And the idea that it is of the same level for people to point that out, maybe with a little bit less grace than they should have, and actually doing those things and promoting those things and promoting the guy who does a lot of this.
Right.
As if those are the same thing. Now listen, here on Restless, if any of these people came out and said, you guys out there, the internet, the world, the scriptures, you were right, this was a bad thing, right? I by the way, I'm not saying the scriptures and us internet people are the same. Right. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that some of these things that are obviously, clearly, biblically wrong. If you just came out, like we said, if someone like a Tim Keller or others came out and just said, wow, yeah, I didn't know about these things, right? This is horrible. Obviously, I condemn them fully. If Francis Collins came out right now and said, wow, I've been engaged in some horrible things, if he repented,
right,
I would start to think, okay, maybe there's something to the fact that maybe this guy could be trusted. The reason that we think this is such a like problematic understanding of what faithful presence is, of being faithful, is because these people, because it would hurt their power and influence, because they refuse to lose their power, their influence, their money. They refuse to say, you're right, we were wrong. Right? We were wrong in doing this. This was sinful,
yes.
or this thing happening in the organization was sinful. Instead, they quietly delete articles. They quietly just move on as if nothing happened. Ed Stetzer just keeps on going as if he didn't have a hand in hurting so many people in all of these various church situations that he helped promote.
And the idea that I feel like these people wounded the faith by accepting a de facto state religion.
Yeah.
No, that is a degradation of the faith.
Yes.
That's not my feeling. And regardless of how I feel about it, if there was repentance, but the silence and we move on is not how we let the healing begin. And I will say, it is interesting, neither side will be following Erik Erikson's advice. They will not take a week off this and go after the wokes for a while, as he put it. They're not going to take that.
Right.
They're not going to take that advice because it violates the whole faithful presence mantra. They can't do it.
Yes.
And of course, neither can we. But
man, yeah. So I'm heated. I know.
But,
so here's the deal: the very idea, like the basic idea of faithful presence, is actually good, right? Like it's in the idea that like you as a Christian in your particular roles should be faithful. Yes, absolutely. And actually, yeah, that is the way that Christians influence culture. I actually think that part is true.
Yes. And I'll let me give one historical example. Pastor Michael has his Bible open, and then we'll let him finish there with a positive thing. This is actually the way Martin Luther saw how cultural influence worked. Now, let's think about this. I would be hesitant to hear anyone critique Martin Luther's his immoderate tone with the Pope, calling him the fart blast of Satan. Like he was known for these kinds of zingers. But only an insane person would think, "Wow, we need to let the healing begin." Popes, maybe stop attacking the Protestants for a minute, and Martin, you've got to let it go. But even Martin Luther, when he spoke to the normal Christian, he said, serve your neighbor. Do your duty. Right. He didn't say what everyone needs to do is follow me in fighting what we might call the direct battle of the Reformation. But the way he taught people to be husbands, fathers, milkmaids, and shoemakers and farmers did change the world. And in the most positive light. And so I just think it is an example of a person, which is, again, this is always the problem. It's always the false dichotomy, isn't it? And so, Pastor Michael, please bring us home with some Bible, because I don't know how long this I don't know how long this has went.
Yeah, Lord have mercy. Hey, maybe I don't know if I crossed the line at any point. I don't think I did, but it's possible, because I was pretty heated about this one, or I got heated as we talked about it, because it is frustrating. So one of the passages that is often used to talk about the idea of faithful presence is from 2 Timothy. There are different, or 1 Timothy rather. This is 1 Peter, chapter 2, starting verse 11, says, "Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation." That's often used to describe faithful presence, and I love that, right? Like this idea, obviously, here at Restless, we fully support and throw all of our cultural weight behind the authority of Peter writing in his epistle. But this idea here is often said, well, just like he's writing to these sojourners and exiles. Well, we're like that in today's society. The issue with kind of this modern understanding of faithful presence, like we're talking about it, is that you never do anything that would get Gentiles to talk poorly of you. Right? So where it says, keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, right? In other words, the Gentiles, those unbelievers.
Yes, this is so good.
When the way that you live and the things that you believe, they are going to call you an evildoer.
Right.
That's what's going to happen if you are faithfully present. But, he says, what you need to do is live such an honorable life that even when some unbelievers do that...
You are so faithful.
You're so faithful.
You are such a good farmer, father, and citizen.
Exactly. That others see that and they say, well, I know that that's not true. And instead they glorify God on the day of visitation. And this kind of ties back to what I think is probably the best passage when we think about, hey, what does it actually mean to be faithful while present in the world?
And let me just, again, contrast that with what is the current model of faithful presence. It's all of the Gentiles will speak well of you.
Yeah.
Right? Like, not call you an evildoer. It's, we need to do this in a way to make sure none of the Gentiles call us evildoers.
Yeah, and if the Gentiles, the unbelievers, if they are saying bad things about you, if they're calling you an evildoer, such as evangelicals involved in the kind of Trump White House, if they're saying those evil things about you, well, that is a degradation of our cultural witness. No, like, that's not necessarily the case. Now, I'm not defending everybody in the Trump White House.
Of course.
There were some crazies there, absolutely. But, man, like, this, it's just it is such a lie, is what it is. It really is a lie. And maybe some of these people tell it to themselves. Like, they actually believe it. Maybe some of them are telling it, like, out of, this actually deceitful heart. I don't know why they do it. But it's not true. So here's where I want to end. Before I start saying even more, it's just going to get me in trouble. Why do you make me do this, Matt? All right. So this is from Matthew 5, starting verse 13. You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. Right? Let them see your good works. Let them see your good deeds. Right? Boldly take those courageous stands, right, for the truth. Not as like an internet jerk. Right? Not like, well, I have to be the guy on Facebook that tells you all of my cultural opinions. Who cares? That is not the same thing as like a courageous stand on God's word. But live a holy, godly life, even when it is hated. And do so knowing that as you are, part of this light of the world that the church is, people will see that, and by the grace of God, by the work of His Holy Spirit, they will come to glorify our Father who is in heaven. That is faithful presence.
Thank you all for making it through this episode of Restless. Wow.
Yeah. Oh, man.
It could have been 3 episodes.
It could have been. That was a lot, but hopefully it's helpful. If you have any questions, concerns, criticisms, hey, send them our way,
And join us on Patreon, because there might be a lot for those folks to talk about. And if you want more Restless, there's more of it there.